thank you everybody for making the trek here to the Bong Su room. I hope you've seen some of the interesting zoo animals along the way. And I'd like to kick off this session on innovation at the Threatened Species Summit and introduce your chair for the session, Professor Helene Marsh. Thank you.
So my name is Helene Marsh, and I guess I've been invited to do this today because I chair the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, and there are several other members of the Scientific Committee here who could briefly identify themselves. What's the deal about the slides? Are they happening? Okay, it's just warming up. All right. So there's often a bit of confusion about what the scientific committee does, and I thought I'd take just a couple of minutes to explain that before I introduce the panel. Actually, while this is warming up, why don't I get the panel briefly to introduce themselves, and then we'll go back to the TSSC. So, starting with you, Ewan.
I'm Ewan Ritchie from Deakin University.
Rachel Lowry, Director of Wildlife Conservation and Science at Zoos Victoria.
Adrian Bunning, ANU.
Andrew Weeks from the University of Melbourne.
So can I have the first slide, the real first slide for this? So that's the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, and I just want to have a one slide to explain what we do. So threatened species is obviously a wicked problem, saving threatened species, and there is a cycle, an adaptive management cycle. The Scientific Committee is a statutory committee of nerds, and our job is to make recommendations to the Minister about identifying and listing species, and also signing off on recovery plans, and again making those recommendations, and also TAP plans. So for example, the plan for the threat abatement plan for feral cats that was handed out to you this morning, we had a role in that. The green side is where all the action happens, and that's where Gregory and his team are acting as entrepreneurs, innovators, and galvanising everyone to action. But we play a very important role in enabling that to happen. This is a session about innovation, so I'd like to just spend a minute telling you about the innovation that the Threatened Species Committee has, I guess, capitalised on and introduced recently. So we're inspired by the Action Plan for Australian Birds, which was led by Steve Garnett, and he came to us and said, you know, we've done all this work harnessing the scientific expertise of Australia, and actually our listing, which is for IUCN, is much more up to date than the national list. And we think you should take advantage of that. So we did. And then John Manowski and his team took it upon themselves, inspired very much by the work done by Garnett and his team, and they did the action plan for Australian mammals. And then the TSSC said, well, actually, we think that these are wonderful models, and that the government should assist and help. And so the next one cab off the rank is the Action Plan for Australian Frogs, and there will be others. This is enabling the revision of the list to be accelerated, because the actual work is being done, initial work is being done by the scientific community of Australia, largely pro bono, and we are incredibly grateful to you. So thank you very much. The bottlenecks are still there to some extent, in that the there's a statutory process, which is quite a rigorous process, and we can't just, people can't just come to us and say, this is what we think, and just change the list. We have to go through a series of steps that are specified in the Act. So yes, there will be other action plans, but we can't be swamped with action plans, because obviously the currency of those scientific recommendations is very important. So I hope that clarifies things, and I'd now like to get you and Richie to give us some very important information about innovation in rewilding. Thank you, Yuri. Now, you are going to have to go boom, and then you have to close this, and then, you right? And you can go, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much to the conference organisers. We'll just wait for my first slide to pop up, and particularly Gregory Adams for the opportunity to speak here. I'm going to take my very few minutes to be deliberately provocative and talk about rewilding. And I think rewilding is a fantastic opportunity to actually right some of the wrongs of the past. Although this is a threatened species summit, I think we really need to be focusing on systems and interactions between species, and the importance of functions of species, and how, if we can bring those functions back to landscapes, we may actually have more effective and more efficient conservation in the longer term. So I want to focus on restoring, restructuring, and re-engaging. I always like a good quote, and I think this is one of the best quotes going around, and it basically sums up ecology in a nutshell. The tragedy of extinction, aside from losing that species itself, which of course is a horrible thing to occur, is that we lose what those species actually do in their natural habitats. We lose how they interact with other animals. We know in Australia, as an example, we've lost 30 mammal species in the last 200 years. To put that in perspective, North America has lost 1. Why? We've had red foxes and feral cats ravage our native fauna. But at the same time, we've also had changed fire regimes, we've had habitat clearing, we've had a whole range of other changes that can also affect the impact of those feral cats and those foxes. As an example, you open up habitat, foxes and cats can find native prey more easily. How do we resolve that? How do we deal with that issue? So if we focus only on single species, we may be missing the picture, and we may not actually get the outcomes we want. We have to actually acknowledge the fact that lots of species are interacting, and once you affect one species, of course, there'll be knock-on effects right throughout the system, just like we saw with the Yellowstone example. You bring wolves back, and a whole chain of events happen that you might not have otherwise predicted. So we really need to focus on the importance of species interactions. And that's really important to also consider in the context of predators. Now, I'm going to focus today on predators as rewilding, but you can rewild with large herbivores. A whole range of species can be used to rewild with, but I'm going to focus on predators today. And predators themselves are in trouble. So around the world, 80 to 90% of our large predators have declined towards extinction, in some cases local extinction, and that's in the oceans as well as on land. So right around the world, in particular our large carnivores, are in a lot of strife. So in fact, the very animals that can help us to control things like feral cats and foxes are themselves in trouble. So restoring, we've got these issues in Australia, and some of the big ones are overgrazing, and that includes native animals. People often forget about the impact of kangaroos. Yes, we have feral goats. Yes, we have rabbits. Yes, we have feral pigs. We have horses. We have donkeys. They're all grazing, but so are kangaroo numbers. What keeps kangaroo numbers in check really well? Quite often, dingoes. And yet, we're getting rid of dingoes left, right and centre in parts of Australia. Why? Feral cats, of course, are a big focus today, but they're not the only issue. Predation comes in many forms, not just feral cats. Raptors, varanids, reptiles, they can also prey on species, and that can be affected by how much habitat cover you have. And red foxes, you can see the red fox there sniffing out an area in a recently burnt site. That's some work done by a PhD student of mine, and he has shown that when you burn a habitat, there's a threefold effect in terms of the number of critical weight range mammals, so that's your bilbies, your bettongs, etc. Those sort of animals are eaten after fire because foxes and cats can move in and capitalise on those areas that they're exposed in, and so they have a disproportionate effect following fire. We need to therefore take these effects into account within the same system. So you've got a herbivore effect potentially going on in the same system, you've got predation effect going on with cats and foxes. And these species interact as well. Foxes kill young eastern grey kangaroos. Foxes also kill feral cats. But if you only focus on one species, you may not have the outcome that you want to. How do we do this? We need to restructure our habitats and our ecosystems, and that's where rewilding comes in. Okay, these are just two examples of approaches that we could take to be ambitious and to actually think about different ideas or ways of conserving species. People often say the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. We could sometimes say that's what we're doing in conserving our species. Some things that are failing, we are still doing them. We're not acknowledging the complexities of systems. Why can't we, as an example, trial bringing back Tasmanian devils to the mainland in Wilson's Promontory National Park in a controlled, experimental fashion to get on top of overabundant herbivores, to potentially get on top of feral cats and foxes, and hopefully therefore have an indirect benefit for some of those native mammals like bandicoots, etc. We could do that. Dingoes. Everyone knows about dingoes and their importance in the landscape. There's over 12 studies that have shown that dingoes have a really strong effect on particularly kangaroos, but to lesser degrees also foxes, in some cases cats as well. So we know they have a really strong structuring effect in the ecosystems they occur in. So why not, as an example, in the Mallee, where we have big problems with kangaroos, big problems with feral goats, why don't we entertain the idea of bringing dingoes back to help us achieve our aims? We could spend lots of money shooting kangaroos and shooting goats and having to do that continually, or we can ask the dingo to do it for free, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and let dingoes do what they do best, which is, in particular kangaroos, is keep their numbers right down, which therefore has benefits on habitat. If you get less grazing pressure, more habitat. Benefits for the other species. Yep. And I'll finish with re-engaging. This is a quote from my son. And the reason why we should rewild is it will inspire people. We are increasingly disconnected with nature and the natural world. Bringing animals back and showing that we can actually have a positive effect on the world will actually make people care about environments and want to do more. And that's another primary reason why we should be doing rewilding. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to introduce Rachel Lowry from Zoos Victoria.
Zoos really have a choice to make, and that is we can sit back and be involved in recording extinctions when we're contacted at the 11th hour, when people are trying to get endangered species or critically endangered species into our ICU unit. Or we can position ourselves as proactive conservation partners and extend our conservation efforts well beyond the ICU unit approach. And 4 years ago, with the support of the Victorian Government, Zoos Victoria did announce a very strong and public commitment to our Victorian species. And we decided it was important to do that because we truly believe that zoos should be fighting extinction on the home front and investing in the species at their doorstep first and foremost. Dr. Dan Harley led a review looking at which species across Victoria actually urgently required our interventions and investment. Utilising that criteria, he found 16 Victorian species far too close for comfort to the brink of extinction. At 16, and another 4 we were not willing to remove a commitment from just because they weren't Victorian. And so that led us to having a priority list of 20 fighting extinction species. Though much of what Ewan said before rang true to us. We hadn't been winning the fight. This wasn't the first time we made a public commitment to fight extinction, yet we hadn't recovered any species yet. So what was going wrong? What could we learn, and how could we be more effective partners? That was a review that took place over 18 months, engaging a range of partners, and we found that innovation was seriously lacking through a range of recovery plans. Often it was hard for one recovery team or a range of stakeholders to articulate one clear, compelling vision and all say the same thing. And it was also difficult to find good plans with timelines, with costings, with exit strategies, succession plans, contingency plans, good plans. As a consequence of that, when we went and did market research with potential donors and philanthropic audiences, they didn't really feel that they had enough confidence to invest in threatened species recovery because those 3 key things were missing. And we were also aware that there was more opportunity for engagement and integration between the social and biological arms of conservation. As a consequence, we worked really hard to try to position ourselves more effectively as a zoo-based partner by releasing 2 strategies, the Wildlife Conservation Master Plan and a Community Conservation Master Plan. The first is our biological arm of conservation, the second is our social arm. These are our partners and we work closely with recovery teams, and some of the innovation that shines through these projects include trialling predator avoidance training for helmeted honeyeaters pre-release. We are seeing some promising results with recruitment rates having more than doubled, and we need to do more research to look into that. We've invested $500,000 in open flight aviary for orange-bellied parrots at Werribee Open Range Zoo to increase behavioural fitness of birds prior to release. A $250,000 investment in a purpose-built facility for bawbaw frogs with some world-first husbandry underway. And the poster child of the master plan is the eastern barred bandicoot. The recovery team have set a very clear vision that maps out success, and that is for this particular species to be back in Victoria beyond feral-proof fences, something it's currently not. However, we know feral-proof fences are important, and Nigel Sharp, who's here today, owner of Mount Rothwell and Tiverton Station, is very keen to invest in the use of drones to actually do the checking of feral-proof fences to see whether or not he can reduce man hours, and I think it's an innovation worth mentioning. We're also going to invest $500,000 in trialling Maremma dogs as guardian dogs to see if they can reduce predation rates on species such as eastern barred bandicoots from foxes and cats. And we have Chris Johnson here today, who's also received an ARC linkage grant to help us out with that particular research. And we're finding that cute little puppies are helping us raise funds. We've got a $30 million master plan. We have $17 million to raise. That's the short of that slide. That's what we'll be focusing on in the next 4 years and coming and talking to all of you. But it's underway. And just finally, to come to a close now, the integration with the social. Quite often we mistake the conservation issues as being biological issues when in fact the root cause are socially driven issues. The Love Your Locals campaign will ensure we don't do this work in vain. If Victorians don't stop and love their local species, then it was all for nothing. And as a consequence of that, we're working with social scientists to develop profound experiences. We've actually taken this very seriously. Dr. Liam Smith has actually at times wired people up to ECG machines to measure emotive arousal responses of zoo experiences to see which things engage people. We do attitudinal, knowledge and behavioural mapping across our visitor experiences. We've developed fighting extinction heroes across the 20, declared our love for the species across public transport, commissioned artists and celebrities to sing songs about these species, and finally, my last slide, Emily Dunstan here at Zoos Victoria commissioned art to be installed through ACDC Laneway in Melbourne to try and reach a new audience and bring these species to life. And so there's some really exciting stuff underway. It's a very short insight into the Zoos Victoria's fighting extinction model, and we look forward to working with you all in the future. Over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Adrian, would you introduce yourself while I get your slides, please?
So I'm Adrian Manning from the Australian National University, and I'm the research leader for the Mulligan's Flat Goorooyarroo Woodland Experiment. I'm also a trustee of the Woodlands and Wetlands Trust, which is an independent association that's... Okay, so... So the Mulligan's Flat Goorooyarroo Woodland Experiment has been going about 10 years, and it's a partnership between ANU, the ACT government, CSIRO and the James Hutton Institute, largely funded by ARC linkage grants. Back when we started, the ACT government came to us and said that they really wanted to take a more proactive approach to conservation management, and particularly in terms of evidence-based conservation policy and action. So they wanted us to devise an experiment that could help them do that, support policy. So our site is the Mulligan's Flat Goorooyarroo Reserves on the north of the ACT, about 1,600 hectares of woodland, and just there, the suburbs are right up against it there, and we've now got some new areas coming into the reserve. So the ecosystem type is boxgum grassy woodland. 92% of it is cleared. 5% of it that is left is in good condition, and by good condition we don't mean 1788 good condition. It's a relative term, and it's now listed as a critically endangered ecological community. So with that came the extinction of many species, particularly some important ones, that functional species that structured that ecosystem. And Mulligan's Flat Goorooyarroo is the best example of and largest example of this ecosystem type in public ownership, managed for conservation. One of the things that underpins everything we're talking about today is the issue of shifting baseline syndrome, or extinction of experience. This comes from fisheries science, and it's the idea that when we are young, that's how we measure the environment around us. in a degrading environment that gets worse over each generation. So we get less and less ambitious, we expect less and less from our environment. So in our local environment, we've just got a pattern through time of the loss of species. Right up until 2013, we lost the hooded robin from Mulligan's Flat. So that process is still going. And one of the reasons that the ACT government came to us was to do something about it. So our research site is what we call an outdoor laboratory, where our aim is to look at how we reconstruct this ecosystem and do the science to tell us how to do that. We've put in a whole load of treatments in place, added 2,000 tonnes of deadwood, excluded kangaroos. We've got some of the highest densities of kangaroos in Australia, eastern greys. We're using fire in the ecosystem, and also we're excluding our ecosystem engineers, species that dig the soil. And then over the last 10 years, we've had a process of looking at that ecosystem and following the different changes in response to our treatments. They've got a website there with more information. So our big idea, and Ewan was just talking about this, our big idea is about rebuilding the whole ecosystem, not a habitat or a plant community, but the whole ecosystem together and all the different parts. The animals you see there in the black are the ones that are still there. The ones in light grey are the ones that we've lost. Now, the one that our first big reintroduction was the Tasmanian eastern bettong, which is an ecosystem engineer. That is, it digs the soil looking for truffles, and through that affects the soil conditions in the system and so forth. So we worked with the Tasmanian government and brought 60 bettongs over to the ACT, and we've conducted intensive research on them since 2011. Now, one of the things to think about when we think about ecosystems and shifting baselines, when you think about it, all trees you see when you come to Canberra that are over 120 years old germinated in soil that was dug over by bettongs, and that process has been lost. So a profoundly important ecosystem process. The next part of our research program now is this idea of multi-species reintroductions, not single species, but multi-species reintroductions, and also importantly sequencing them in the right order. So here we have at the bottom there, we've got the eastern chestnut mouse. We've obviously got the bettong, yellowfoot antechinus, and also at the top, the carnivore, the quoll is the next thing that we want to bring back. The other part of this evolving this site was the idea that we needed to build a predator-proof fence, and we also needed a way to manage it. And governments don't have endless money, so we really needed to fund above business as usual conservation. So the idea of an independent trust, the Woodland Wetlands Trust and Mulligan Sanctuary, came about to support the conservation actions that are going on at that site. 485 hectares and 11.5 kilometres. And the idea is to give people a glimpse of future possibilities. So we've got a programme there with the staff from the Woodland Wetland Trust, night walks. We've been lucky enough to have the minister along, that's Bella the Bettong there, and also the US ambassador. And the Woodlands and Wetlands Trust is engaging and telling the story of the work that we're doing at Mulligan's Flat. Importantly, our next big initiative is Extend the Fence. I'd like to thank the Minister and the Commissioner for the announcement today. That's really important to us. We've also got a campaign, Bettong Bungalow, with Brian the Bettong, to help support expanding the sanctuary. Just finally, the final part of what we're doing is our outdoor laboratory is really the starting point. It's the jumping off point where we do the research. The next part of what we're doing is beyond the fence. How do we get these animals out into the landscape? And really that pathway back out into the wild is what we're all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew, can I get you to introduce yourself while I find your slides? Thank you.
G'day, I'm Andrew Weeks from the University of Melbourne. I'm a conservation geneticist, and I'm going to start by telling you that genetic diversity is very, very important if we're to save a lot of our threatened species. It's what makes all of us unique. At the population level, it's certainly what provides resilience, and particularly to environmental change. Now, genetic diversity, and particularly the loss of genetic diversity, is intrinsically linked to extinction risk. And there's many examples of this, and we've seen this many times with different species, but probably something that we're familiar with most right now is the plight of the Tasmanian devil. and the devil tumour disease. Now, this disease is thought to have got hold of this species because of its lack of genetic diversity. It's a lack of genetic diversity that resulted from bottlenecks that occurred thousands of years ago. It no longer has the diversity in the disease fighting genes, and therefore it's unable to respond to this devil facial tumour. Now, what actually causes losses of genetic diversity are essentially small population sizes and fragmentation. And unfortunately, that's a pattern all too common that we find with threatened species. This is the bridled nail-tailed wallaby. The blue is its former distribution pre-European times, and those dots are its current distribution. There's actually only one remnant site in Queensland. The others are introduced sites, including the Scotia Sanctuary in New South Wales. We find it also with the brush-tailed rock wallaby. We have 3 different regions where we find populations of brush-tailed rock wallaby, and the one in the southern area, which is in Victoria, is a single population of about 20 individuals. We also see it in the eastern barred bandicoot. Here we have them present in Tasmania, and we have them only present in Victoria because of breeding programs that have been going on at Zoos Victoria and a lot of different sanctuaries over the last 20 years. Now, I'm involved in a program that is looking at how we can actually restore genetic diversity. Not only restore genetic diversity, but try and increase the resilience of populations. And that's something that we're calling gene pool widening. There's many other references in the scientific literature, including genetic rescue or genetic restoration. But we've been pioneering this approach with the mountain pygmy possum. The cute little individual you see here. It occurs also in 3 restricted regions. In the southern area at Mount Buller, in the central region, the Bogon High Plains, and in the Kosciuszko National Park. The Mount Buller population was only discovered in 1996, and unfortunately, it's had vast habitat changes through time on this mountain. It occurs right in the areas of ski fields. This is the Mount Buller Ski Resort. In 1970, you can see the comparison to 2004 in the changes of habitat. The prime habitat occurs in this area here, the Federation area, and it's also the prime area of a lot of ski runs at Mount Buller. Now, unfortunately, population monitoring showed that there was a massive decline in numbers in this area. We went from a population size that was estimated to be about 300 down to only about 30 individuals in a 10-year period. Now, what paralleled that was a massive genetic decline as well. We went from normal heterozygosity levels, genetic variability, down to about 10% of that genetic variability in that period of time. A massive drop in genetic diversity. So we pioneered an approach where we took males from Mount Hotham in the central region and moved them across to Mount Buller. And we did this in 2010 and 2011, and this led to hybrids being formed between those 2 individuals. This is where we inserted those individuals, and as you can see, there's been a rapid increase in population size since we undertook those translocations. Now, this approach wouldn't have been possible without a lot of the efforts that went on at Mount Buller around habitat recreation by the Mount Buller and Mount Sterling Resort Management Board. And you can read a little bit about that. I noticed in the threatened species strategy that was announced today, there's a case study in there that discusses the efforts that were undertaken there, which included predator control. So where to next for us? Well, we're looking at applying this in a number of different species. We've already started applying it in the brush-tailed rock wallaby, the southern brush-tailed rock wallaby, by taking individuals from the central region and crossing them with southern individuals. And this has been done in fence conservation reserves. We're also doing this in the eastern barred bandicoot, and that's a project that we're about to start over the coming months. And that's going to be taking individuals from Tasmania and crossing them and restoring genetic diversity in the eastern barred bandicoot in Victoria. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that while gene pool widening has great practical application right now, in the conservation area, there's actually, in the conservation genetic area, there's actually a lot of different technologies that are coming on board through, I guess, the genomics area that's happened over the last 10 to 15 years. Those include, we understand a lot more about the genes which underlie traits. We understand how we can actually use that to benefit biodiversity conservation. But there's also technologies that are coming on board that are going to enable us to look at how we actually control feral animals, a lot of the feral species that we see. And this is to do with gene drive. It's a technology that just came a couple of years ago where we can actually manipulate genes and we can actually then drive that through populations. Now, there's a lot of ethical questions around this, and there's a lot of debate in the scientific community about how we would actually apply this. And that we shouldn't be remiss is going to be an ongoing question. But the technologies are becoming available where we can wipe out a lot of these feral animals. And I'll leave it there.
Right, so we now have probably about 20 minutes for discussion. I'd like us to focus the discussion at a fairly high level. If people have detailed questions that they would like to ask our speakers about the specific examples that they raised, can I ask that you do that at afternoon tea? Each of our speakers is going to have a flag, and they're going to take the flag so you'll be able to identify them. So I figured that was a way, I didn't necessarily choose the flags, I want to say, that would be a way that we could try and keep the discussion at that fairly high level. And so I'd like to open it up by asking if you have questions about the potential for cutting-edge science to save our threatened species. And do we have anyone who's brought questions from Twitter or other social media? No. Okay, over to you.
I think this was more to Adrian. We've got lots of these programs that are running at the present time. Is that on? It is? Oh, good. We seem to have a number of programs where we're rewilding specific areas, and I understand why we need to do that. But at some point, if we're really serious about taking, other than them becoming just big zoos out in the countryside, we've got to get the rest of the community to be able to provide a landscape in which these animals will survive. Have we actually gone to that community bit that was, I think it was sort of, you said beyond the fence and the community partnerships? And to me, that's probably the more interesting area for me as a regional NRM group. Then, while what you're doing in the science that is involved in rewilding those particular areas, it's the expanding it out into the region that is the sort of stuff that our future is made of, if you like. Have we done any work in that space?
Well, I think, things like Western Shield and things like that have already sort of pioneered that sort of thing. I guess the role of these specific sites, we can study these phenomena associated with restoration in a level of detail that's not possible in a wider landscape. So we sort of work things out. For example, there are things to do with reintroducing the Tasmanian bettong, eastern bettong. I'm pretty convinced if you'd gone straight to a wild release, it would probably have failed. So it's an example where you have to work that out in that situation, then you can go beyond, and that's why we're going beyond. In a way, the community engagement part of that is something that we've yet to follow up because it's new territory for us, but it's obviously going to be critical when we're getting those animals out, because in a sense we control quite a few of the variables with a fence. When you go beyond, obviously there's more variables, you're in a different landscape, it's bigger, etc., etc. So that's going to be part of the learning experience. We certainly don't have all of the answers now, but that's where we'll go next.
So would any other member of the panel like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I guess I'd just add to that I think in terms of rewilding, and I guess using predators as an example, that's going to be critical to have that social buy-in, if you like, because of course there will be some potential issues, livestock raising being one of them, but it's also worth bearing in mind that there's solutions for that which are not being supported as much as they could be. So, guardian animals come to mind, of course. Compensation schemes, which have been used incredibly successfully in other parts of the world, should have a serious look at, as opposed to, say, bounty schemes and things like that. So I think we can use our conservation dollars and our investment dollars, if you like, in some cases quite a bit more cleverly than we currently are.
Thank you.
Yeah, what I've sort of noted, and you've touched on it a bit about social science, it seems to be the place where, other than the zoo, we're sort of underrepresented on the panel. And the other area which I see an underrepresentation, and there's no reflection on the people that are up there, and obviously there's only 4 chairs, is in other sciences that, such as technology and electronics and all those sort of bits and pieces. And it just seems to me that quite often, as a 36-year career in conservation, we always look at each other in the room, and sometimes we don't turn around and look outside the room and say, what have these other people got to offer? And they might not be involved in conservation at all. And in fact, the biggest breakthrough in one of the recovery programs I worked on was from the security industry, cameras and video monitoring and stuff like that. Any comment?
I probably won't comment on the social science point, because I think that's fair cop, that we probably need to do a much better job across the board in engaging the social sciences, and I think most scientists would actually recognise that now. The question comes back to training as well. I think we should be training scientists much earlier in their careers about all sciences, not just the life sciences as an example. On the technology point, I think, to be fair, many ecologists are actually using a whole range of technologies currently, and or work with people that do. So of course camera traps is one thing that you mentioned, but drones are being used increasingly. I'm currently working with people using very high resolution mapping of landscapes from the air from a couple hundred feet, where you can get 3 centimetre or less resolution using thermal imaging and other types of technology. So I think there are a lot of biologists actually doing that already. But yeah, again, we could probably do more.
David Kendall is somewhere, isn't he? No? Okay, because he's the social scientist on the Threatened Species Committee, and he's been, he's there to remind us that threatened species problems, as Rachel said, are largely social problems, and the solution is going to rely on engaging the community. Rachel, do you want to add to that? I mean, obviously the zoos have had far more experience on this than many other areas.
Really, I think Doug McKenzie Moore, those of you that have been exposed to him and his community-based social marketing techniques, is worth looking at for guidance there, because he speaks very directly and frankly and in a language that everyone can understand, because sometimes social scientists use a different language and that can also become a barrier. But he says, marketeers, for example, get us to buy stuff we don't even want. They're that good at influencing us. So we should be looking to the marketing community to find a way to actually build and activate values around these threatened species. If they can sell stuff we don't want, surely they can take these species into the public domain and get people excited about them. And I think as a community, we undervalue science communication, good science communication as well. And so I just think, there is social science, but then there's also, I've got 2 great social science communicators in my team. You can hand them a thesis and they'll turn it into an infographic. You can hand them an ARC linkage grant, they'll turn it into an elevator sentence. We need to start working out who those people are and working with them more as well.
Thank you.
Could I just say something on that as well? I guess that's one of the reasons that we've created the Woodland Wetland Trust as well, is that community engagement side of things. And I pointed out at the start there that we're right on the boundary of growing suburbs. We've had a PhD student, Kathy Isles, specifically looking at changes in people's relationship with the reserves, and I anticipate we'll probably do a lot more of that. And also the involving of artists as well. We've had an artists in residence program recently engaging people. So I think it's a case of making sure that the overall team covers all of the bases, and then through that you get an osmosis of the different perspectives overall should emerge when you're doing these sort of projects.
I think Rachel's comment about marketing is very interesting. I recently had a conversation with a senior academic professor of marketing about the fact that many NGOs were nervous about species that had recovered being delisted, because they felt that was may damage their fundraising potential. And this person said, well, that's ridiculous. if you involve professional marketers, it's actually quite easy to turn those stories around into very positive stories that will engage the community, the funding community. So I think that's an example of where actually being better engaged with people that know about marketing can make a difference. David, sorry.
Oh, hi, Kingsley Dixon.
Kingsley, sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
that's okay. Call me whatever you want. I think this really touches on a very core issue, and in another part of my life, I'm very heavily involved in Coast Care community actions, particularly along parts of the metropolitan coast of Perth. And the thing that I find is really necessary in funding and grant applications, it would be fantastic if we had an extension and marketing component built in there, where you actually have those resources to do it. So we get great stories out of our Coast Care group, but we've got to crank out our own little newsletter, print our own little T-shirts, run our own little community days. And I like to think we're very good as an inner urban Coast Care group, but I believe the funding agencies need to now think very seriously, and I think it is a fundamental part of innovation, that we start building that in as a funding byline. How much do you need to run a marketing campaign to get your good message out?
Actually, some of the NERP hubs did have that requirement. So, other questions? Mena.
How policy translates into legislation. For example, one thing that's also lacking in this is how social science and policy translates into legislative change, and the prime example of that would be cat control. If you want to comment on that.
Well, we do have some experts in the room. Jeff, you'd like to comment on that? Okay, you've been...
So I think today isn't the start of it, but I think it'll get a big lift up today from all the announcements that we've heard around feral cats, around the threat abatement plan that the TSSC has recommended and the Minister's now signed off on, which is really good news. So yeah, I do think it's about engaging the public. My understanding is that Environment Ministers met yesterday and I believe unanimously declared the feral cats as a pest, which they haven't been declared as. So again, that's about lifting the profile. It's about getting engagement of the community, if you like, in that. Obviously, there's some risks around that when it comes to culling and knocking off 2 million cats over 5 years. But I think that if we properly engage the community, there should be a lot of support there, and I see this as a really positive step forward in that regard.
So, other questions? Are there any social media questions, by the way? No?
I guess, Andrew, you gave us a bit of a teaser about the potential for cutting-edge science, and I guess that's been the real glimpse that I've seen of a step change to how we manage both cats and foxes. I was just wondering whether you can give us a bit more insight into what you teased us with.
So this is Gene Drive, I assume you mean there. So this is a technology that's been developed overseas. It enables us to actually manipulate genes to create them beneficial mutations within genes as well as deleterious. And so the idea is essentially that you can create deleterious genes and insert them into your different feral species. Now the technology allows gene drive, which is actually forcing that gene through the population. That's where the real innovation comes, because that's been branded about for years in various different programs. But unfortunately, we just haven't had the technology or the ability to be able to drive these things through populations. And so while we might be able to manipulate genes, we haven't been able to put them and force them to go through. So the real advancement now is that this technology, which has come from a bacterial system, is available. It's being discussed very heavily in the scientific community about how we use it, because obviously it's not just ferals or even conservation-dependent animals that we could, change. We could change humans if we wanted to. So it's a debate that's going to go on for some time, but the application for feral animals is very acute and very easily addressed for a lot of the ferals that we have in this country. I've been involved in a program in the past where we use similar technologies. It's not actually genetic modification, but we're controlling mosquitoes in a similar fashion, which transmit dengue fever. It's the same principles. We're not actually genetically modifying there, so it's a lot more palatable, and those programs are actually going on today in Australia and overseas. The genetic modification, as we all know, adds a complexity to it.
Just on that policy thing, we're in New Zealand, so I come from New Zealand, that's why I'm having a bit of a say here, all right, sorry. But the chief advisor to the Prime Minister and a small group of people are actually working on what they call a science roadmap. Now, Canada's got one and a few others. And essentially that says, where does New Zealand want to be in its natural resources sector, which is conservation, all the environment stuff, and also resource extraction side of government, in 20 or 30 years' time. And so at the moment we still have a science planning system which there's not so much planning, but it works on a bid system still. Scientists come up with an idea, yeah, you're in, no, you're not. We're all thinking that it'd be better to say, well, where do we want to be in 20 or 30 years, and then plug your science in to get us there. And that's where I think the policy direction and lawmaking and science sort of all come together. Any thoughts about what's happening here in Australia and whether we can piggyback off you or whatever? We're just another state of Australia.
Is Nick Gale still here? I reckon he'd be. Did you hear that? Would you like to comment on that, Nick? I think that's.
We're already at a 5.
So Scratch and I had a conversation around this a while ago. We go back a ways. And I think even though we like to disagree, we actually agree in principle. In Australia, there isn't anything quite equivalent to that, but I think the whole process the department's gone through with NESP is an attempt to do exactly that. It's undoubtedly better than we did in NERP, which was better than we did in SURF. And hopefully in a few years' time when we're renegotiating the offspring of NESP, we'll do better again. I think one of the real challenges sits with those of us, Jeff and others, and all of us who sit within departments in improving our ability to articulate what it is that is that need, the policy need, in a manner in which it's really clear to the science community about what the particular conservation need is, in this case, of whether it's in a rewilding context or whatever it is, so that the scientists have the opportunity then to bid into a place with the solution where it's really clear what the issue is. So, it's the chief scientist is driving an agenda in Australia around a much broader agenda than this, but I think in the conservation space we're making good steps, but I think we've still got a long way to go. I actually think the New Zealand model is really excellent. I heard their chief science advisor speak at a meeting a couple of years ago, and I think there are some really good initiatives there to look at.
One comment I'd like to make, which is about now rather than where we'd like to be, but one of the things that the Threatened Species Committee finds all the time is that a lot of the science that is done, and it can be incredibly excellent science, but actually it doesn't line up with the way the Act is written and the law works. And we have to advise the Minister in the context of the law. And so often the science is done at, I'm going to say, the wrong but inappropriate spatial scales when you look at the way the Act is written. Now, we could say for some things that, the law is an ass and we'd like the Act to be rewritten, but actually, until that happens, and that's obviously, a policy decision to do that, groups like ours are constrained by the law. So one of my messages to innovators is, hey, if you want your science to make a difference, it wouldn't be a bad idea to read the Act.
Just on the policy side of things, I think I raised there shifting baselines, and I think that has a big effect on policy formulation as well. It's not just the community, it's policy formulation. So I think what you're describing is essentially something like backcasting, where you try and step out of... We're often a prisoner of the drivers and the threats that are going on now, and that affects policy as well as conservation biology itself. So finding ways of stepping out of the drivers, things like backcasting that you've described, I think are a very good way of deriving policy that will get us where we want to be. I don't think there's any point in an act. We really need to look at our actions and say, are they getting us to our end goal? And if they're not getting us to our end goal, we've got to ask why we're doing them. So we've got to become more focused, more strategic about every action we're doing. Is it leading us to where we want to be?
So, are there any more questions? Yes, there are. I think we've got time for two more. One here.
It's not really a question, but I was just going to make a comment around, the translation of science into policy, and just pointing out that Ewan talked about the complexities of biological systems. Scientists often work on particular aspects of a complex system. Well, policy is equally complex and has multiple aspects that it draws on, and science is only one of those. But even within the science that needs to go into policy, it's often not one bit of science that needs to be and be taken into account. It's a synthesis of a number of different areas of science. And that's a message that I think a lot of our young scientists don't actually understand, is that they want to see a piece of science have an impact on policy, but it's usually science together with lots of different bits of other science that synthesise together that can then make an impact on policy and be taken up.
I completely agree with you. Other comments? I think we... Okay, one more.
Just regarding that last point about science and policy, it's interesting. It's an interesting case to consider rewilding dingoes. Nobody really has a problem with rewilding endangered species, but when you want to rewild a species that's by law a pest in states, where states have already agreed to a national wild dog action plan, which is the complete opposite of what's being proposed, those sort of proposals are actually, it presents a bit of a conundrum, because on the one hand you're proposing to do something that's illegal in places where people don't want it. So I just raise it as a good example of this policy into science sort of debate, because it's not as simple for dingoes as it might be for something like a Tassie devil or a bettong.
Can I just add a quick comment to that? I guess that also comes back to how we define species in the first place. What is a wild dog? What is a dingo? And in Victoria, as an example, dingoes are listed as a threatened species, and hybridisation with wild dogs is one of the reasons for that. And of course, there's some evidence to suggest that if we were, continue killing dingoes, that may contribute to that problem. So I think how we define species, which comes back to also social aspects, is critical, and how we even talk about species in a policy setting is critical. But also, just as important is focusing on function. There's so much focus on name tags. If you look at a dingo and you say it's 95% pure, therefore it's not a dingo, why not? If it's acting like a dingo and it looks like a dingo and it smells like a dingo, is it not a dingo? And yet people would say it wasn't. So I think your point is excellent, but we need to actually reconcile how we talk about species and what we focus on. Is it function or is it name tags?
We also need to look, returning to my point about how the law defines it.
Exactly.
And so, for example, that was one of the real stumbling blocks about the listing of koalas. I don't think I'm going to open that particular topic. We could spend the rest of the afternoon. I'd like to thank you to join me in thanking all our speakers and ask them to take their flags so you can identify them if you want to ask them more questions. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the session on practical action. This session explores how science has partnered with conservation practitioners to deliver adaptive management and on-the-ground solutions to supporting threatened species recovery. The chair of this panel is Professor Hugh Possingham. Hugh is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow, leader of the NESP Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and director of 2 national recovery centres. Over to you.
Thanks. Welcome everybody, and it's great to be here. And what I'm going to do is try and move things along reasonably quickly, because I think we've heard lots of talk this morning, and now we're in a bit of a smaller group, so we can actually talk a bit to each other. So we've got 3 5-minute speeches. That's the core of this, and then it's all open to you guys to chat, because that's what I think we're here to do, to exploit your minds as much as possible. I have PhD students. I know how to exploit people. But before I start talking about that, as you know, we have a threatened species strategy. The Minister's announced it. And it's all about research and action and partnership. I think you're here because you're partners. I also wanted to remind everybody in a way that I'm here because I'm exactly the same as you. I wrote my first letter to the newspaper about land clearing and threatened species when I was 15. Okay, so it's almost 40 years ago. So in some senses, this is an exciting day, and we're all here holding hands, marching into the future, saving all these species and making sure no extinctions happen again. But I wouldn't want to forget the fact that some of the people in this room have been devoting their entire life to threatened species. I can see some of them even longer than I have. So we've been waking up every day thinking about conservation and biodiversity. It hasn't always been going so well, but also many things have been great achievements. So we also need to remember that, and the fact we're all on the same team in this whole process, trying to get as much as possible. The 3 speakers are all in their own way superstars of turning science into action and delivering practical outcomes. And one of the things that the Minister also announced this morning was the Threatened Species Recovery Research Hub. So we have a 6-year research program that connects together over 50 scientists in over 11 institutions, 27 partner organisations. It's going to run for the next 5 years, and we're there to do the research. I say the word research sometimes instead of science, because a lot of our research isn't just science. We talk to economists and social scientists and philosophers and psychologists. So it's a very, very broad discipline, research, and we're there to try and make sure that the actions are efficient, they deliver outcomes, and that's what a lot of this session is all about. So unless you're actually evaluating what you're doing, you don't know if it works. And we have plenty of examples of us doing things, and for a long time we just didn't look what was going on. Nobody looked at the data. Nobody actually had a well-designed experiment going on. In fact, what we found out, what we were doing for 20 or 30 years was not only useless, it actually could sometimes be sending us backwards. That's what this Science Hub is there to avoid. We're there to do science that delivers better outcomes on the ground. So for those interested in more details, we do have a little pamphlet which goes through all our themes. I won't go through all the research projects in great detail, but I'll just point out there's things that already have been mentioned. We have a project that John Winarski's leading about Red Hot Red List, no surprises, no regrets. What's that all about? It's just trying to make sure that we don't have any more embarrassing extinctions we could do something about in the short term. So that's the kind of projects we're working on. We're working on the reintroductions and the refugia, the fences, the islands, making places that are safe for mammals and birds and plants, and then also removing threatening processes, fire and cats, that also again help to protect flora and fauna. So it's not just about the refugia, it's about whole-scale management of threats across the landscape. So there are a whole heap of the things we're doing, as well as working on policy closely with our colleagues in the Federal Government Environment Department. So the hub is very large, it's very broad, and I'm not going to try and describe it in detail. But what I do want to do is now move to our 3 speakers. They're all well known, so I'm not going to give you a full CV. They're all being dedicated their life to threatened species and ecosystem conservation. First one is Professor John Winarski. John wrote the Mammal Action Plan for Australia that in some sense has precipitated a lot of these processes, spent an entire career working as a researcher and in the public service delivering outcomes for conservation, alerted the world to the problems of mammal declines in a lot of northern Australia, has achieved many things, and I'm proud to say he's a close part of our research hub. And John's going to talk to you about practical actions and Kakadu. And I'll ruthlessly ring the bell at 4 minutes and 30 seconds.
Thank you. I'm talking about one single project, which is about threatened species in Kakadu. The project I'm talking about has many forerunners, and I'll acknowledge those here. For example, work which Hugh and others have been doing on threat management prioritisation. The particular project that we're dealing with is this one on the right, which is a threat management strategy for Kakadu National Park. Kakadu is a magnificent place, one of the most extraordinary places in Australia and the most important for biodiversity. And it's qualified for World Heritage status partly because it's meant to harbour very many threatened species. And it's difficult to find the statistics, but I think there's no other place in Australia which has more threatened species, which is both good and bad. It's a formidable problem to make sure that those threatened species stay there. So I think there's about 75, depending on your definition, threatened species, and they vary very markedly in their taxonomic character and the types of environment in which they live and the threats which they face. Mostly they're not going very well. Those that we are monitoring mostly are declining. There's a few cases of threatened species increasing, but not many, and there's very many cases of threatened species in Kakadu for which there's no effective monitoring, so we really don't know how they're faring. The graph on the right is one which is the number of mammal individuals in our monitoring plots between 1996 and 2008, and it's an extraordinarily precipitous decline. So things aren't going very well. There's a couple of issues. Basically, how did they get to this state? And the second is, which is the one I'm talking about today, is that given that there's so many things to worry about which are in trouble, which ones do you look after and what's the most effective way of doing it? Essentially, there's 5 components. Essentially, it's a business type model. You look at your assets, your threatened species in this case, which are of varying degree of importance and varying degree of need. There's very many threats affecting those assets. Some of those factors we can control, some of them are very expensive to control. We've got a range of triggers or tools that we can use to control those threats. We have currently a finite amount of resources, but that perhaps could be increasable or decreasable. And this all has to be contextualised by longer term objectives. What are we actually doing here? What do we want to seek to do? So it's essentially a business model. There are very many threatened species of varying value. We can look at ways of prioritising those species, including range taxonomic distinctiveness, but particularly in the Kakadu case, Indigenous cultural value is an important one. So we can do various analyses with and without such prioritisation of species. I myself am egalitarian regarding all species as equally worthy of saving. In terms of managing threats, it's not always straightforward. This is a network diagram for this particular threatened species, partridge pigeon. There's 2 factors in particular which concern it: predation pressure, them being eaten, and the amount of food that they can have. And very many factors affect each of those, and many of those factors are interactive. So if you were seeking simply to control fire in terms of managing partridge pigeons, it wouldn't be all that straightforward because many other factors interact with fire. On the other hand, you can use things like fire to control to some degree the number of feral cats. We need to understand, the science needs to understand how these threats are affecting threatened species. What we did was essentially a very large matrix algebra approach. So we looked at very many experts gave their opinion on the likelihood of persistence of these 75 threatened species in Kakadu over a reasonable time period, 20 years, under current management regimes with absolutely no management abandonment, and with each of 40 plausible management actions, each of which we had a financial cost to and a likelihood of success.
These are the sorts of questions we asked. Which set of actions are likely to provide the greatest net benefit? Which ones, if you only had $1 million to invest, which set of actions would you use to make the greatest benefit to those threatened species? And over the broader term, what set of actions do you want to be reasonably sure that species are likely to persist over 20 years, or maybe even 90% sure that they exist over 20 years? How much would that cost? You can do the maths. It's a very substantial number of pieces of maths to do, but the answers are essentially that if you want to improve the lot of threatened species in Kakadu to increase their likelihood of persistence over a long period, then essentially the most optimal thing you should do is to change the current fire regime, which at the moment is environmentally destructive. Essentially 50% is burnt every year. And you can also control feral cats is important as well. But the answer is actually there is no single answer. If you had $1 million to invest per year, you would do some particular actions, but you'd be likely to lose 2 species. If that's what your objective was happy with, then that's what you'd do. But if you had more money, you can do far greater benefit. So success is also very much dependent on implementation and resourcing. And science can only take you so far. So knowledge is necessary but not sufficient. You also need accountability, public reporting and broad-based recovery teams. You've got to mesh with the park's fire strategy, for example, to make sure that that's not inconsistent with what you're trying to do. In the Kakadu's case in particular, any threatened species management needs cultural resonance, monitoring and working with neighbours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. And I think that's a good example of how prioritisation can deliver a lot of efficiency in terms of outcomes, in terms of saving money and saving more species because you're saving money. So our second speaker is Keith Morris. Keith is probably one of the unsung heroes of Australian threatened species. That's because he's in Western Australia. And where is Western Australia? I have no idea. Somewhere that way. But I first met him when I was asked to review the Western Shield strategy in 2004, and it was an eye-opening thing for me 11 years ago to see how much incredible work had been done in Western Australia, and Keith was a major player in a lot of that and subsequent work. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for this opportunity to talk about an exciting project that we've been undertaking in the rangelands of WA over the last 15 years or so, rangelands restoration. Is that coming up? This has been very much in collaboration with the traditional owners of that area. And the goal of this is to, in partnership with the TOs, to restore the biodiversity and natural ecosystem function to almost 600,000 hectares of rangeland estate in the northeast goldfields of WA by 2020. So we want to do that through implementing a range of management activities, controlling introduced herbivores and the introduced predators, implementing appropriate fire regimes, reintroducing the native animals that used to be there, and monitoring the native and introduced fauna, biodiversity and ecosystem health. And I guess the attractive thing about this project is that it is an integrated project with lots of different people with different perspectives, different skills coming to one area of the rangelands and applying these management activities. And we're doing it in an adaptive management framework, so we're learning by doing. Where is it? There are 2 properties up here, in there, Lorna Glen or Matua and Erahidi or Carrara, and they're basically geographically right in the middle of WA, about 1,100 kilometres from Perth. So these were properties purchased in 2000 by the state government, primarily because they had such a diversity of biodiversity or landscapes still available. They hadn't been heavily grazed, although they were pastoral properties, they hadn't been heavily grazed. And they were purchased to be incorporated into the conservation estate of Western Australia. So you can see down here a map showing all the different landscape types that we have at Lorna Glen. It actually straddles 2 IBRA regions, so it's got a lot of diversity there. At that stage we started joint management arrangements with the Martu, the Wiluna Martu, And I guess that's been strengthened recently because we've recently had native title declared over the area. And just 2 weeks ago, an Indigenous protected area was declared over Lorna Glen and Erahidi. So a management plan's now being prepared by the Martu or for the Martu, and that's going to be implemented. And in addition to the work that we're doing there are many cultural activities with the traditional owners, working on country ranger groups that are being incorporated into our activities at Lorna Glen. So I'll just go over each of those activities briefly. Feral herbivore management, we've got both cattle and camels as issues there. And I guess one of the first things we did was fence the entire property at Lorna Glen or Matua. 250,000 hectares were fenced with a fence that was designed to stop camels and cattle. And we also turned off the waters. So there are no artificial waters on Lorna Glen at the moment, but we're hoping to replace those with some of the natural water sources that the ranger groups are actually discovering and rehabilitating. Introduced predators, feral cats predominantly. There were a few foxes there, but they're not really a major player in the system. And we do that primarily through dropping about 180,000 baits annually over Lorna Glen, plus a 5 kilometre buffer into our adjacent property, so about 350,000 hectares are dropped at the coldest and driest time of the year. And that has a knockdown of between 55 and 80% of feral cats. So we do that on an annual basis, and we follow that up with targeted trapping if we need to. Fire management is an area that the traditional owners play a big role, and we've gone from basically, certainly in the sandier parts of Lorna Glen, to a homogeneous landscape type because of big fire ages, to one that's more a tight mosaic, which is what we're aiming for. And you can see from the different colours there that we're now achieving our aim there of having a very tight mosaic of burn ages or vegetation ages on Lorna Glen. And as I said, the TOs are very much involved in that work. Fauna reintroductions, the area that I've been mainly involved in. We've got 11 species on our target list. Most of them are threatened. Where since 2007 we've reintroduced the bilby and brush-tailed possum successfully. And we're about to next month reintroduce the golden bandicoot. We had a bit of a setback with some of the species like bandicoots and marla in that the existing cat control was not adequate for those, where it was adequate for possums and bilbies to survive. So we built a fenced enclosure of 1,100 hectares, more or less in the middle of Lorna Glen. And this is this section here, that's 1,100 hectares. We have got plans to expand that out to 5,000 hectares. So this will be entirely feral proof, and we've introduced or reintroduced golden bandicoots, booties and marla into that pen in the hope that at some stage we'll be able to move them to the outside of Lorna Glen where the other cat control is undertaken. Monitoring, of course, is a very important part of our activities, both introduced fauna and the native fauna, and innovative techniques like using drones for helping to monitor bilbies are being trialled there. So in conclusion, we're combining a range of management practices, skills and perspectives to demonstrate that we can recover fauna in the arid zone. And I think some of the lessons we learned from Lorna Glen will be applicable to other rangeland areas in Australia. There are ongoing challenges, but we are making progress towards our goal. And I guess there are lots of opportunities at Lorna Glen for collaborative research with other groups. And we've certainly been talking to the Hughes Group, NESP, about opportunities to work at Lorna Glen in the future. Obviously, consistent, effective cat control at landscape scales is essential, and the recent focus that we've heard about today and earlier about feral cat management in Australia and the support of governments for that is most welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Keith. It's great. It's good to see such large-scale conservation actions happening. Our next speaker is David Lindenmayer from ANU. He's part of the leadership team of our Threatened Species Recovery Research Hub. David has had a long history of working on threatened species, not only doing an enormous amount of science, but practical actions in woodlands, in Booderee, in the Central Highlands here in this state, achieving outcomes for conservation and policy, but also trying to communicate those outcomes. And so the thing that David does that I could never bear to do is he actually writes books that normal people might read and therefore might be inspired to do some conservation work. And I think that's a really important part of David's job as well. Thanks, David.
Thanks, you. I'm not going to make you suffer through yet another PowerPoint presentation. Rather than give a case study, or many case studies, I'm going to give a few observations. First of all, yes, I've been doing this a long time. That's why I've got lots of blonde hair and a healthy dose of irritable male syndrome. I'd have to say that I really do actually welcome the threatened species strategy. I've been following this game for the best part of 40 years. And in that time, I've seen 10 federal ministers, 12 state ministers here in Victoria, 7 name changes in Victoria for the various departments. And I think this morning was quite extraordinary to see a set of politicians that are actually more across their brief than I've ever seen before. That's really quite extraordinary. Now, I know some people can read briefs really well, but some of these guys and girls actually really did know their stuff. So a lot of discussion has come about partnerships. And that's a really interesting perspective. But in terms of action on the ground, one of the critical parts is actually the science. And that almost sounds like it's trivial to say we need to have the science as part of this. But I recall a distinct conversation in 1996 with a new Minister for the Environment telling us to get out of the way. All we needed to do was plant the trees and we would have it sorted out. So that was the $3 billion Natural Heritage Trust program. And we now know that we got about $1.5 billion worth of value out of that $3 billion. But with some science, we probably could have got $10 billion worth of value out of that. And I think it's really important in the next 5 to 6 years in this space that we get the maximum value out of these investments as we possibly can. We do now know how to do restoration work in temperate woodlands. We know how the remnants and plantings should go together, how they should be located, where they should be located, how they should be designed. And we've seen very strong responses of temperate woodland birds to those kinds of systems. But we also know that it's not just about killing cats or planting vegetation, it's actually working out what are the interacting drivers. Now we know we have to kill noisy miners as well as plant vegetation at the same time. So these threats often go together, either additively or synergistically. So that has been a really important revelation, that the science needs to go together with the management, together with the policy. So I see this as science-led management, management-led science, science-led policy, and policy-led science, and all those juxtapositions. And I see that as being really important, because when we don't do that, we have not a good return on investment, as we've seen, for example, that we could have got through the NHT. And as part of that, I think it's really important that we're able to use the narratives of what is successful, but also what hasn't been successful, because often we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. That's really very important. And we know, for example, that at Budaree National Park, where we've had a 14-year odyssey there, that the fox baiting program has been very spectacularly successful in increasing populations of common brush-tailed possums and of eastern bristlebirds. But at the same time, we've seen the extinction of the greater glider, the ring-tailed possum, the powerful owl, the sooty owl, and next year we'll probably lose the long-nosed bandicoot and the sugar glider. So we need to think about the failures as well as the successes. And we know that that will be an almost impossible paper to publish. There will be people here in this audience that will carve us to pieces, but that's actually the result that we have so far. But we need those narratives, and we need those partnerships that are very honest and very straight down the line partnerships, where people actually talk about what's going on. So I've stood in agricultural landscapes that are 99% cleared with farmers pleading for us for a balance. Pleading for a balance. 99% cleared. Now some of those landscapes support 5, 6, up to 22% vegetation cover, and we've seen very strong responses of some biota. Similarly, I've stood in landscapes with 35 logging coops. 99% of the forest is regrowth, 1.16% of the forest is old growth, and we've got foresters pleading for a balance. we need to have an honest discussion, because in a democracy, an honest discussion is being able to tell people things that they don't want to hear. And that's going to happen in this space, in threatened species. It's happened for the last 40 years and it will happen for the next 40 years. So from my perspective, it's really important that we have on-the-ground action, but it's connected very carefully with the science, and that we do the monitoring properly. My other stark recollection is with the federal government setting up an environmental stewardship program to pay landowners to do conservation works on their farm. The federal government representatives did not want controls in that monitoring study, and the response was, if we don't have controls, we won't know when woodland gets better in the droughts or worse in the rain, or vice versa. And it was only when we pointed out that if it rains, everything gets better, but we can't tell whether the stewardship sites are better than the places where we don't do stewardship. Monitoring is always the last thing that we fund, and it's always the first thing that we cut. But we can't tell about return on investment. We can't tell on what's successful and what's not without it. So I know I'm coming back to the partnerships, but it's really important that the partnerships include not only the community, which we've heard a lot about, but the science that goes with that to guide us in the best way to actually do the things that we want to do. Thanks.
Great, thanks David. So we've had three very succinct and inspiring talks, but now you have to work, I think, because apparently sometime this afternoon I've got to report back in 5 minutes about the brilliant pearls of wisdom that come from this session. I've only got about 25 seconds from these guys, maybe 30. So
I'm ready to write down all the pearls of wisdom.
that's right. Exactly. So it's open for questions for one or all of them, and questions actually are questions. If I start hearing people giving a lecture, I know what lectures are like. I do them all the time. I'll probably stop you. Yeah. We might have to wait for the little microphone. Millions of people from all around the world are listening to
Ken Flower from Northwest Local Land Services. Yeah, just a question in relation to what we look at. Being that 80% of the biomass on the surface of the earth and the seas is smaller than the human eye can see, have we got an overemphasis on just the things that we can see, and have we left the others out, or are we covering that as well?
That's a hard question. I'm not going to answer that. What's a prioritisation question? John, so you must have an answer.
Yeah, very good question, of course. It's about functionality and resilience, I think, and those things of which you speak are the basis of ecological systems, and we do need to make sure that we're not forgetting them. I think measures of ecosystem health will generally, even if they're blunt, be some indicators of the health and status of invertebrates and microbes. But yeah, I mean, it's very easy to, and we all do it, focus on cute and cuddly, furry and feathery animals. On the whole, they're not bad indicators of environmental health, but they're not perfect, of course.
So one of the research themes is to look at the value of some of the higher order vertebrates as surrogates for some of the lower order other things that we don't measure. And there are data sets to be able to do that.
To some extent, I think there's been a dialogue in Australia between those who are looking at broad landscape scale health and ecological functionality and those who are looking at threatened species. And I think what we're trying to do, I guess this debate is maturing, I think, and it's, we're capable of doing both.
Yeah. One of the best things about Australia is we are allowed to list threatened ecological communities, and let's face it, that maintaining samples of grasslands, grassy woodlands, dry rainforest, that's probably the cheapest and most efficient way of securing the huge diversity of other things. And that's also one of the research themes in our hub is actually focusing on the communities, and the fact that we have legislation to protect them, I think, is very important as well.
And sorry, I was just going to add, I think the focus on invertebrates has increased. Certainly in WA, half our threatened fauna lists now are invertebrates. So although there has been a focus on the cute and cuddlies and the larger things, many of our threatened fauna are now invertebrate spiders and things like that. So.
I had a lady in red just here. That sounds... That's right.
My name's Tessa Yakshevich. I'm the CEO of Landcare Australia. There's still some kind of 6,000 odd Landcare groups out there around Australia. Just sort of building on David's commentary around policy, science and community. Just sort of wondering if you've got any thoughts about how we could better harness those resources and make them, be as effective as they possibly can be in terms of what they're doing and how we could communicate messages to them, because we do have a strong channel to all those groups.
Absolutely. That is a real challenge. Often it involves scientists actually having to recognise the importance of that connection, and often it's not the scientists in universities but scientists outside of universities that speak paddock speak in the right kind of way to be able to connect with those kinds of people, to do that at multiple levels, not only at the farm level but also, for example, LLSs and catchment management authorities and others. There is a large amount of information in that space, and one of the challenges is to think about how to bring that together and then convert it into a method that, or a set of principles that can then be worked with. We have particular strategies for people to be based permanently in regions to be able to connect with that, but that's a real challenge to be able to do that, especially with the de-skilling of a lot of regional bodies at the moment, which is a real problem. One of the big issues, I think, is to be able to get back into the headspace of people like Barnaby Joyce and others and indicate that this is a really important area to work in, and lobby local members and others to reinvest in part of the regional model to make it happen, because it has been successful in the past. It should be and it must be successful again. And next time around we should use more of the science to try to make sure that we invest in the right ways. And part of our NEST hub will do that, but there's a lot of other people potentially connected in those kinds of areas as well, here in Victoria, elsewhere in Queensland, or New South Wales.
Yeah, it's also, I think, partly about recognising that there's important knowledge in Australia which is maintained by people on the land, by Indigenous groups in particular, and that to manage Australia well, we need to blend science and knowledge which is held on country by people who know about that country. And the other component of that is that we also need to ensure that there's good education standards in many of these remote groups, particularly Aboriginal groups, such that, that ultimately it will be the Aboriginal groups who have the scientists who are well trained as well, who know both sorts of knowledge and can work on their country. It's it's a generational issue, but it's got to be done.
Yeah, I like to think Australian applied ecologists have worked more on engagement and communication over the last decade or two, and across agencies, and also and I suppose email, internet and all those things have helped those things. I would have to say that our research hub has devoted around about 15% of our budget to engagement and communication, but we're actually being put under enormous pressure to reduce that engagement and communication. So if anybody in this room actually wants us to talk to you, then you may want to tell the politicians that it's not free. Engagement and communication is not free. It's not something that we do on Sunday morning. Actually, it is something we do on Sunday morning, but we can do more of it if we actually devote some of our resources to it. So our group has always produced Decision Point, and we do try and get our message out through a whole variety of media, but I know that we're touching the top of the iceberg, and if we continue to get cut on engagement communication, then unfortunately a lot of these issues won't be solved.
I guess if you go back to the 1990s, there was a kind of a real call, like Decade of Landcare, there was a kind of call, there was a very tangible call to action around some specific themes that everyone was kind of getting behind at that time, from community to government and industry, and the answer have that same.
Yeah. And let's not forget Peter Cullen, who coined, I think, the term knowledge broker. I could be wrong. Andrew will correct me if I am. But that coining of that term is saying that collaborative research centres, these large-scale natural resource management centres across the country, need to invest. He argued for 20 or 30% of their budget in communication, engagement and partnership, and he coined the term knowledge broker to do that. And I don't want that to slip back, and we need to remind people we can't spend all our money on the on-ground action. We have to think about the actions, we have to evaluate the actions, and then we have to talk to people about them and write about them in the ways that are digestible. Yep.
Thank you. Steve Meacher from Friends of Leadbeater's Possum. Leadbeater's Possum in the strategy has been listed for emergency intervention, but there's precious little detail of what that actually means. So I'd just like to invite the panel to say what they believe emergency intervention should mean in a very practical way from the point of view of the scientists. Thank you.
I think that'd be you.
Probably David.
Maybe not.
That's all right. I can have some views.
Yeah, well, mate, the analysis now that's been done indicates that the least cost, most tractable, most scientifically defensible, evidence-based, I don't know what other terms you have to put with it, is to remove the key threatening process from the system, which is industrial clear filling. And at the same time, Australia will meet about 8% of its direct action climate abatement target. I rest the Victorian government's case.
I guess the other component of that could be, you know, in some species cases, removing the animal from that situation until you can ameliorate that threatening process. And it's immediate action to hold the animals or plants until that threat has been sorted out. But it's probably not a desirable place to be.
Concerned about the emergency part of it, because as we're sitting here today, a nuke, where I live in Langley, is being logged in critical habitat. So what does emergency intervention mean when we're actually still clear for critical habitat?
That's right. And Regent Honeydeh faces its most important breeding site about to be bowled over. So yes, we can't walk away from saying that many of the actions are not about doing wonderful things, killing cats, getting rid of weeds, restoring fire regimes with traditional owners. They're wonderful things to invest in, but also sometimes prevention is better than cure. Not doing stupid things is invariably a much better investment of money. But, and we certainly, I suppose, are all here vocally supporting those things. John's prioritisation approach can be applied to all those sorts of ideas about where do you get the biggest bang for your buck, and so often that's to stop doing something that's bad rather than start doing something that's good. And we shouldn't leave that off the table, I think. Sorry.
But can I just respond as well? But the core piece of evidence is that we have case after case where monitoring data indicates decline of species, and those declining species ultimately become extinct if the threats aren't changed. You know, we've got far too many examples of that in Australia. Decline in monitoring data should not be taken lightly.
Yeah.
Frank Banty from Save the Bilby Fund. I guess I'm very fortunate to have lived in far western Queensland back in the late 40s and early 50s, and I worked on Thalungra, which was the biggest sheep station in the world. But most of those big properties were well over 200,000-300,000 and above in those days, and they all had people to control feral animals. You know, you could go there today and you'll see some old dingo traps hanging in the sheds and still around the place. And then suddenly we decided that was too much country for a company or a person, so we cut them up into 40,000, 80,000 blocks, a whole lot of them. And wild wool was a pound, that was fine, but when the backside went out of wool, then he had to run twice as many, and your land went degraded and everything was cut to pieces and no more feral animal control. And it's just got worse from that point of time to where we are today with it. I'd like to, John and your crew, I admire your work and I think it's absolutely brilliant. I'd like to suggest to somebody when you go home tonight and put your heads on the pillow, we need to whatever plan we come up with, it needs permanent funding. They're going to put their heads in the sand and saying it can't, and we can't leave it to politicians. We're going to have to say to them, these are the things that we want. And the things that I talk about is practical, it can happen. I mean, politicians for a long time over, when it gets near election time, will spend and do whatever, not for the cause, but for another term back in there. And sadly, it's true. I go back to Tim Flannery with the Pripistel in Christmas Island, you know, and he went to the rock singer and looked for $300,000 to save the thing. And he believes, him and his crew, that they could have, and I believe they could have too. But sadly, they couldn't find the money. They couldn't find it for us when our cats invaded our large wild population of bilbies at Estrella just recently. I even went to Clive Palmer and said, you know, can you come up with a chopper for 3 or 4 days? We finished up shooting something like 5,000 cats over that area, and the last 120 we had all had bilbies inside their stomachs, which was devastating to me. And I got into the minister, the current minister, and said, you know, you must be able to find a hollow log with a few dollars for it. But thankfully, Andrew Powell, the Queensland minister, came up with over $300,000, and we got crews out there that could shoot, and we've learned a lot from it. My point to you is, we will never get proper funding unless we suggest to them how we're going to get that. And we need to, in my opinion, form a committee made up of scientists, graziers and people to distribute that money. It's got to get away from government. We would get a whole lot more people that would donate money, and companies would donate money, if it wasn't tied up in government. People don't trust them, and you can't blame them either. I don't. So I'd like to think that we could look at coming up with a way to where we can say to the rest of Australia, and indeed around the world, if you want to come in on this, it's got to be permanent. All the plans that we make, you still need that local grazier and that local farmer. He owns the land. He knows where the waters are, and he knows how to control it. We've lived off the sheep's back for a long, long time. These guys are hurting there. We should be paying them to do this. They know how to do it and where to do it, and we've got to fund them for it. We've got to look to find those funds to make the thing happen.
I agree. So maybe the question is, how do we secure long-term funding? And maybe I can put that to the panel. I think that's the key question.
I do.
Yeah.
And John, I've got to say, I do a lot of school. Your list of 20 gone is really magic. I get the kids to take it home to their parents and say, go on the internet and have a look at what you'll never get to see in the real world. Schools is where we've got to put a lot of emphasis in, and I'd like to think that before I go down the hole, I can shame government into doing a lot more than they do, which is very little.
I think we all agree. So the last government, the Labor government, David and I and others had a series of meetings, and we proposed an Australian fund for zero extinction, an Australian Zero Extinction Fund, and we said $1 billion. Okay, $1 billion, you know, that's 2 weeks of defence spending. And that would allow us a $50 million a year endowment. We could spend $50 million a year on threatened species, which would solve a significant fraction of our problems. 2 weeks of defence spending buys you securing Australia's threatened species for almost forever. We didn't win that one, but we tried, and so I agree with you entirely. Does any of the panel want to make a comment?
Yeah, Cuz, just 3 very brief sentences in reply. Your last point, it's haunting and sobering always to walk around in graveyards, but we must do that because...
Would you believe me if I told you in London there's a guy who wrote a play called Bodge the Bilby, it's like Peppa Pig, and it's now almost on terms in popularity in the state, and he wanted to help our fund in a way. So we've been going 3 years on this project, and we've actually now got 19 schools that come online on one channel doing work with us in Australia with our bilbies and other species. So conservation and ecotourism can be a big money spinner if we can get the right people to listen and do it. Where you're going to see a kangaroo can climb a tree, lumhole should be in every bloody zoo in Australia, but it isn't, you know. And so we need
John,
to
do you want
more.
to answer? John, answer
just
the other two things.
two brief things. You're right that the children, the repairing the damage that's been done to Australian environments is not something which should be at the beck and call of whims of short-term government change. It's a generational issue, and the fact that you're educating children is really important, I think. We can't imagine these problems will be solved in 1 year, 2 years, or a political cycle of 3 years. So it's a long-term investment that we need. The second thing that you raised initially was that we do need people on the ground in remote areas managing country intricately, the way that Aboriginal people or others used to do it. You know, we can't pretend that the vast remote Australia is in good health, because it's not. We need people on the ground managing well and in a collaborative manner.
I would add one other thing to that, and that is that if we do the interventions properly, we can actually save ourselves significant money in the long term. And so it becomes quite cost effective if we know what works and what doesn't, and why it worked or why it didn't work. And that's a true investment in where we should be taking the country.
Great, thanks. Barry?
Barry Trail from Pew Charitable Trust. Question on specific to cats. I think a lot of others, have been very excited over the last decade more. Projects like Lorna Glen, which Keith talked about, of really nailing feral predators, particularly cats, in more intensively managed landscapes, enclosures. That's been great. But if we're to be successful, we also need to be, what can we get over tens of millions of hectares? And I've been probably even more excited by some of what I perceive as some of the research results showing that if we keep dingoes in the landscape, manage fire, this is in outback landscapes in the north and the centre, keep dingoes, manage fire, get rid of big herbivores, one of which is doing something which is not doing something, kill dingoes. One requires people on the ground to manage it. One is removing big herbivores, which is quite achievable fairly cheaply in most landscapes. We can get measurable reductions in the effectiveness, measurable reductions in how impactful cats are and foxes are. That doesn't seem to be from a 2-minute skim in the cat abatement plan. Just any questions or comments on being able to get the big scale?
Well, I think we're aware of the issues that you raise about dogs or dingoes. It's a big debate in conservation circles at the moment. Some people say they should be left in the environment, and others say there's no evidence that dingoes do in fact help keep cats under control, or foxes for that matter. So I guess the jury's still out on that, and there's a debate in the scientific literature about that. Certainly the fire aspect, AWC and others have shown the attractiveness, if you like, of fire or burnt areas to cats, and that's one of the factors that you have to manage. And I guess the point of any landscape scale conservation management has to be taking all these factors into account. You don't just focus on getting rid of the cattle or killing the cats or whatever. You have to have a multifaceted approach. And I think that's what we're trying to demonstrate that we can do at Lorna Glen. And it'd be nice to see other projects like that up and running as well. But you're talking millions of hectares. Well, you've got to start at the hundreds of thousands, and I think even that's a great step forward compared to just small reserves in the wheat belt or wherever. So it's a stepwise progression, and we're learning all the time with some of these issues that affect feral cats and dogs and other predators. So it's stay tuned, I guess. It's
Yeah, I'll reply. What's the word?
Diplomatically?
No,
He's
not
trying to be
diplomatically.
polite, and I know it's very difficult.
I'll try to crack a joke. So cats have been messing with people's heads since ancient Egyptians, and have essentially been outsmarting humans. It's time we stood up to them. The particular question you asked is a pivotal research question that we're dealing with through the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. We are trying to understand how effective the manipulation of fire, grazing and dingoes can be in actually delivering not only reduction in cat numbers, but also increasing threatened species through reducing the impact of cat predation across many sites in Northern Australia. And that's a sort of a 5-year program of research. We want to make sure that it's practical and that it will deliver, and deliver not only competently in terms of delivery of threatened species recovery, but also doing it in a more cost-effective way, probably, and more humanely than things like baiting. So we should be able to roll it out.
Could I have a more refined question then?
from what I've got, John, is in my head it's already, the jury's in enough to start doing that stuff. But are you saying the jury's not in to start doing it, but we can refine it? Or we should wait for more information?
Yeah, there's sufficient indication that it should be done, and it can be rolled out as a practical and demonstrate that, and through monitoring, that it is effective. But we haven't got the evidence from all environments in Australia in all sort of climatic areas.
Great, thanks. Peter Stronach from Landcare Tasmania. I just was interested in about, David, you're talking about NHT, and yeah, we did blow a lot of cash. I work it's with state-based programs with 200 groups and a lot of individuals. I've just been through the Biodiversity Fund, and we had some great outcomes, but I just wanted to know, you talk about linking the research with the on-ground practical. I still don't think we're there, because there's still a lot of multi-million-dollar on-ground projects going on through NRMs or through federal government. How do we link the research closer to those on-ground actions? I mean, we're watching Green Army unroll, but there's no technical support for those projects. There's nothing in the budget for those things. What's the best way, do you think, to bring that closer together
in
for
general,
everybody?
my sense is that we have a bit of a flawed culture in Australia, which is there's a giant rush to get the money out the door as fast as possible. And by and large, the psyche for me is that when things are complex and multifaceted like that, you should actually slow down, not speed up. Okay, that's politically not always palatable. The other side of it is that there's always a sense that we have to be doing on-ground things and that we have to do 100 projects, for example. And my sense of it is that maybe we should do 85 projects and hold back 15% of the money and at least invest in some partnership research to understand what the effectiveness of our particular intervention is across that program, so that at least we have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 model programs that tell us what are we actually getting, is it effective, did we make things better or did we make things worse? We know, for example, that parts of NHT with lots of narrow strips of plantings on some farms, we made it worse with more noisy miners. We could have solved that problem, and we can still solve that problem, but we need to have some monitoring and research allied to a component of these big programs with a smaller number of programs to tell us what's actually happening and where and why, and then carry that knowledge into the next program and the next one. Because what we have is this incredible process where there is very little understanding and knowledge that's shifted from one program to another. So it's almost like an impermeable barrier from one program to another. And inevitably, we're dealing with a new set of bureaucrats with a new program that don't understand what came before. And I understand why that is, because there's this constant process of everyone being a generalist and never having the expertise in a particular area before they move to another place. But we have to break through that culture in Australia to solve some of those problems if we're going to make the progress that we should.
You want to say something, John? No. Okay, one here and then one over there. Yep, Andrew.
Andrew Campbell from Darwin University. If I could just follow up on that same point. It was interesting hearing the New Zealand minister get up and talk about a 50-year or 2050 predator-free New Zealand. That strategy was developed under the previous government. And here we have a Nationals minister getting up and talking about the strategy for a predator-free New Zealand. And so I think in Australia we've got all the ingredients to have the world's best natural resource management framework, or we have had since about 1990, but we keep putting a new thing in and using it to undermine what went on before. So you've got the grassroots voluntarism, you've got the regional model, you've got the top-down investment, science-based, asset-based approach, market-based instruments and so on. Virtually every time we've gone to one of these new paradigms, we've undermined. When we brought in Caring for Country, we did so by cutting the budget of the regional bodies by 40%. When we brought in the regional model, the national land care winning group of the year from the previous year was evicted from its offices by the NRM body. So we're very, very good at kicking out the building blocks that have gone before and then announcing the new broom, usually with a change of government and rebranded and all the brochures and all the crap that goes with that. Now, we have built a forgetting system. We've got institutional ad hocery and amnesia hardwired into the system. If we can, and it has to come from civil society, to say to governments, look, I'm sorry, we're just not going to cut this crap anymore. It needs to be bipartisan. It needs to have long-term memory built in. There's got to be a monitoring component hardwired. And we want to make sure that if you've got a 10-year program, that the people who are going to be in government after you are up on the podium when it's announced. When Bob Hawke announced the decade of land care at the junction of the Murray and the Darling, the shadow minister was on the podium. And that's why we got a decade of money. Rick Farley insisted that the Conservatives had to be part of the package. And Farley and Toyne made that happen. Against fierce opposition from the bureaucrats in Canberra, I've got to say.
So I think we all agree, Andrew.
So
do you want to have a question?
Well, my point is that it's going to be the people on the floor here, across the range of different NGOs, community groups, professional associations, philanthropic bodies, industry bodies, representative bodies, have to create a critical mass that says to ministers, sorry minister, we're not going to let you get away with that second-rate superficial approach. We've been there and done that. We've wasted a lot of taxpayers' money. We now know what ingredients we need for a world best program. We're not going to settle for less.
Any comments before the last question?
One would totally agree, but I guess there are some examples which are worth celebrating in Australia, which do have support from both parties. It's a very antagonistic and short-term cycle that we live in. But things like, I guess, domestic violence, stolen generation of Aboriginal people and stuff like that, there are some core moral issues which both parties will agree on and recognise that there are long-term requirements for solutions for these things. It's not ideal, but there are cases which give you some hope, I guess, that we can escape that terrible short-termism.
We do a good enough job of auditing them when they do operate bipartisan. We should be much better at giving kudos when that happens.
Last question.
Thanks. Guy Ballard from the Vertebrate Pest Research Unit and the University of New England. Given who's on the stage, it's not surprising to hear about adaptive management, monitoring with controls, science and learning. But looking at some of the stretch targets, aspirational funding goals that have been talked about this morning, I think it's important to ask, should we be funding projects where we can't learn from them in a robust way? And how do we deal with that in the political framework around threatened species funding?
For me, I would come back to this this notion that at least part of the funding that's set aside for killing 2 million cats, at least we hold some of that money back to try to understand what's the difference between a place where we kill X number of cats and places where we don't kill X number of cats, what happened before and after. So it doesn't have to be huge right across the program, but at least some areas where we do hold some money back and we do try to learn from what's happened, and then take that learning into the next tranche of this. The worst thing is not to know what's gone on and not to be able to report to the Australian shareholder who owns the country, what did you get for your investment? Because then we are truly environmentally bankrupt by not being able to tell people what happened. What did we get for killing 2 million cats? Got to be able to say that in 5 years.
So I get, there's also hope that, as the Minister announced, that Threatened Species Recovery Hub, there's a major focus on actually doing science as a key component of this effort that he's making. And, that's actually, I think, quite encouraging.
Sure, but some of the projects, even though they're in the large areas, we still actually only have a sample size of one for treatment. Can we learn in a robust way from that?
I think we all agree. So we're winding up. I'll say a few things at the end. Is there a question that anybody has that if they don't have get to ask this question, they'll burst into flames. So it looks as though there's 3 people who are going to burst into flames. Where's the microphone? Well, it's closer to the gentleman with the blue shirt. So the others, you just burst.
Sorry to the others. Mark Backman, Nature Glenelg Trust. I'm really interested in self-sustaining solutions. We do a bit of this with work we're doing in Western Victoria, South Australia, restoring wetlands, where if you address the hydrological regime, you create the conditions for species, some cases nationally threatened, to thrive and go on in a self-sustaining way. I guess a concern I have with our approach to threatened species generally is the need for ongoing human intervention. What is the panel's thoughts about developing self-sustaining solutions where we introduce a change and then we can allow nature to take its course?
Good point.
In terms of feral cats, for instance, if you're on an island, I think you can do that because you can eradicate cats, and then you let things take their course and away you go. But unless you're planning to eradicate cats over all of Australia, then you can't just leave it alone. That's from a feral cat perspective. You might be able to reduce cats through habitat manipulation, but you're never going to get rid of cats to the extent where they're not going to impact on some native.
That's exactly right. I guess that's the subtext of the question, which is that surely there's a point where we accept, much like if we were in Australia 5,000 years ago and saw the first dingo make it across, we would have treated them as a feral at the time. Surely there comes a point where we accept that the ecosystems have changed and these species, for all the effort we're putting in, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. And to go back to the Tasmanian example, we find ourselves in a situation in Tasmania where we have had species cohabit, and the corner of the mainland where I'm interested in the temperate zone, we've done a lot of work. All the species that have dropped out here in this part of the mainland are still in Tasmania, cohabiting with cats. And the only ingredient that looks different is the presence of devils. So, and the argument goes that the establishment of foxes obviously has been hampered by their presence. So that's the subtext, is surely there are some smarter ways we can think about how these ecosystems function.
Any comments from the panel? I think that balance between investing in things where you're going to have to do them for seemingly forever, and things where maybe you can kick the system to a place where you can walk away. I think it's a really big question.
I mean, probably the other complicating factor, if you like, coming back to introduced predators again, is not all native species are equally susceptible to cats and foxes. And in the southwest of WA, we've had species surviving with cats and foxes with none of our intervention, but they were incredibly tiny populations that perhaps in the longer term weren't viable. And now with firstly fox control, they've gone away, and now hopefully cat control, they'll do even better. So, and yet other species won't survive even with one cat. A golden bandicoot or a marlin or something, they're just so predator naive. So you may get an Australia where you have a reduced number of species, maybe quolls, for instance, that have persisted with foxes and cats, but you're diminished because you've lost, your 25 other species or so. So, yeah.
Well, see, a lot of that will, like we're missing the apex predator or this many biggest.
The classic answer to your question also is if you stop the indiscriminate slaughter of dingoes in many parts of Australia, you're likely to be far better off.
That's right, there's your dingo.
Dingo reintroduction in this part of the world, this far south obviously, is not as palatable potentially as the use of another apex predator.
Of course. I'd agree.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. I think we had 3 very succinct and powerful speakers. Thank you very much. The take-home message I have, lots of take-home messages. I've got 4 minutes to summarise all that. Hopefully it will be representative. If you want to lobby me between now and a coffee, then go for it. To me, it is that we really do have to commit to doing things a lot better. Maybe we just do a little bit less, but do it a lot better. And we do it a lot longer, and we commit to things in the longer term, and we don't change everything in 3 years. I know there's people from the United Kingdom and America who come to my lab all the time, and they look at what we do and they say, Australia is incredible at conservation, but you have a disease of change. that is, and it happens in the university sector as well. I have not been in a university department with the same name for 5 years for my entire life. And it doesn't mean I change university every 5 years. So we have a disease of change, and we're not seemingly willing to commit to things all the time. And I think that's a really important message we can all send back to our political friends at various levels. But I thank you for the very engaging questions, and it was a great session. Usually I dread these sort of sessions, but this was about 100 times better than anything else. Thanks for the quality of the session. Thanks a lot.